Date: June 15, 1940. Location: Ardennes region, France, the edge of a dense forest near the village of Saint-Jean-de-la-Bretonnerie, on the border with Belgium. On this day, in the middle of the morning, the air was thick and heavy, soaked with the scent of rain and damp earth. The forest roads, winding and muddy, were almost empty, except for a few scattered soldiers walking along them as if searching for something invisible. But beneath this quiet lay an undercurrent of unease, a tension that even those who didn't understand what was happening could feel. German tank columns had already begun moving through the Ardennes, and no one expected that it would be here, in these thick woods, that one of the most extraordinary episodes of World War II would unfold. One man, a simple pilot, once an aviation instructor, now a volunteer soldier in the French army, stood at the edge of a clearing, pressed against an old oak tree. His name was Jean-Pierre Marté, 37 years old, a former mechanic and civilian pilot who had volunteered for the army when war broke out. He had no combat experience, but he possessed sharp thinking, calmness under pressure, and deep technical knowledge, especially of aircraft and engines. And today, he found himself right at the heart of an event that would change his life and perhaps the fate of hundreds of soldiers. Before this day, Jean-Pierre had worked at a small airstrip near Paris, training young pilots. When Germany invaded France in May 1940, he immediately went to the front. He was assigned to a reconnaissance unit, where he used his skills to analyze aerial photos and relay intelligence. But when his unit was destroyed in battles near Sedan, he lost contact with command and ended up behind enemy lines, deep in the Ardennes forests, armed only with his backpack, maps, compass, and an old pistol. He didn't know what to do or where to go, but he knew one thing: he couldn't give up. He moved through the forest, avoiding main roads, until he heard a deep rumbling sound, like the ground itself was vibrating. He froze. It wasn't the noise of cars. It was the sound of tanks. Many tanks. Jean-Pierre peeked from behind the tree. On a dirt road leading deeper into the woods, a long, endless column was advancing slowly. Panther and Tiger tanks, with their massive hulls, black turrets, and gleaming tracks, looked like giant metallic worms crawling through the earth. They moved slowly but confidently, every movement calculated, merciless. Behind them came trucks, armored personnel carriers, soldiers in gray uniforms with rifles slung over their shoulders. The column was enormous. By Jean-Pierre's estimation, at least 18 tanks and more than 200 soldiers. He realized this was the main thrust of the German 6th Panzer Division, heading towards the Paris front. If they passed through this valley, they would encircle French forces positioned north of the Meuse River, and if the French couldn't hold them, Paris would fall.
But what could one man do against 18 tanks? Jean-Pierre closed his eyes, recalling lessons from his aviation school days. One of them: strength is not always in numbers. Sometimes the decisive factor is timing, location, and the ability to use limited resources. He remembered how, before the war, during a flight over the mountains, his plane suddenly lost altitude. He couldn't regain control, but instead of crashing straight down, he used the terrain, veered into a slope, not downward, but sideways, and survived. That moment taught him, you can win not by force, but by using your surroundings wisely. And now, he faced impossibility again, but he wouldn't surrender. He chose a spot, a small hilly rise from which he could see the entire road. From there, he watched as the tanks approached a crossroads, a narrow path leading uphill to the hillsides and downhill to the river. This crossroads was perfect for an ambush, but he had no mines, no explosives, not even grenades. All he had was a pistol, a map, and an idea. He recalled that back at the airstrip, he'd helped repair engines. He knew how fuel systems worked, how cooling systems functioned, how even a small stone could damage an engine or simply clog it. He also remembered that tanks, especially Tigers and Panthers, were very sensitive to overheating, especially when moving over rough terrain. His plan was simple, yet reckless. He would wait until the tanks reached the crossroads, then approach the first one, get close, and try to block its cooling system or fuel line. He didn't think he could destroy the tank, he thought he could disable it, and then the whole convoy would have to stop. Tanks move one after another, so if the first stops, the rest are forced to stop too. Otherwise, they'll crash into each other. And if they stopped, the French forces would have time to regroup, organize defenses, call for reinforcements. But how to get close? A tank is armored, 30 to 50 millimeters thick, and armed with a cannon that could fire from over 1,000 meters. He couldn't approach with just a pistol. He'd be eliminated in seconds. Then he remembered something else. Airplanes. He knew there was a small airstrip nearby, abandoned but with a short runway. He decided if he could find even one plane, even a damaged one, he could use it as a trap. He headed toward the airstrip, moving quickly but cautiously. After 2 hours, he found it, overgrown with weeds, abandoned, but with one plane still there. An old two-seater training plane, a Marine Saulnier, likely left behind after bombing raids. The plane was damaged, wing broken, engine clogged with dirt, but the fuselage was intact. And most importantly, several unexploded bombs were still on board.
Jean-Pierre approached the plane, inspecting it. He couldn't start the engine. He had no key, no fuel, but he could set it on fire. He found several bottles of gasoline in the cockpit, remnants from the last flight. He poured them onto the wing, then the fuselage, then onto the bombs. He knew the bombs might be unstable, but if he lit them, they'd explode, and the blast would be powerful. He thought, if I set the plane on fire, it will go up in flames and maybe damage the first tank that passes by, or at least stop it. And if it stops, the whole convoy stops. But how to ignite it? He had no matches, only a pistol and a knife. He found an old piece of wire in the cockpit and remembered the plane's electrical system had a battery. He opened the hood, located the battery, disconnected the wires. Then he connected them to a piece of metal lying nearby. When he brought the wires close to the gasoline, sparks flew. He'd created an improvised lighter. He waited until the tanks drew closer. He saw them moving slowly down the road, soldiers stepping out of vehicles to check the route. He knew, now or never. He ran to the plane, lit the gasoline. Flames erupted.
He threw the wire into the bombs, and within seconds there was a thunderous explosion. The plane blew up, not completely, but enough to send parts of the fuselage and wings crashing onto the road, while fire engulfed the first vehicle in the convoy, a truck leading the tanks. Soldiers screamed. The tanks slowed. The first tank, a Tiger, stopped because its driver couldn't maneuver around the burning wreckage. The second tank also stopped, not because it wanted to, but because it couldn't pass by. The convoy halted. Jean-Pierre didn't know what to do next. He ran into the woods, hiding, watching. He saw soldiers getting out of the tanks, trying to figure out what happened. They didn't know what kind of explosion it was or who caused it. They started searching in the darkness, but the forest had too many shadows, too many trees. He knew he had to keep acting. He couldn't just leave. He had to scare them, make them believe there was a force in the woods they couldn't defeat. He found an old tractor, abandoned, but with a working engine. He started it, turned on the headlights, drove to the edge of the road where the first tank was parked. He turned on the siren, which he found in the tractor's cab. It wailed like a demon. The tank crew stared at the light, at the sound. They didn't know if it was a real tractor or some kind of ghost. They began shooting into the darkness, but missed. Jean-Pierre slipped back into the woods. Then he found an old radio station, discarded in the bushes. He didn't know how to use it, but he remembered learning basic radio communication in school. He connected it to a battery, turned it on. Within minutes, a voice came through. "This is French reconnaissance. We confirm your position. You are surrounded. Do not move. Reinforcements will arrive in 3 hours." It was a fake signal. He'd created it himself, using codes he remembered. He didn't know if anyone would hear it, but he hoped it would make the Germans pause, realize they weren't alone. He sat in the woods, trembling, not from fear, but from determination. He knew he'd done everything he could. Now he had to wait.
An hour later, he heard the tanks beginning to move backward, not forward, backward. Apparently, the commander decided it was a trap, and better to retreat than risk more losses. The convoy began to withdraw. Jean-Pierre couldn't believe his eyes. He'd stopped 18 tanks, not by fighting, but by cunning. He'd used fire, sound, illusion. He wasn't a hero. He was just a man who refused to give up. He sat on the ground, closed his eyes. He didn't expect his name to become famous. He didn't expect his story to be told decades later. He just wanted someone to survive. Date: June 16th, 1940. Location: forested area near Saint-Jean-de-la-Bretonnerie, France. Morning came slowly. Mist lay over the forest like a white blanket, hiding the ground, the trees, even the roads. Jean-Pierre woke on the ground, wrapped in an old jacket he'd found among abandoned soldiers' gear. He felt pain in his hand, his leg, his back, but more than anything, he felt emptiness. Not fear, but as if he'd just woken from a dream and couldn't believe it had all been real. He stood up, looked at the road. The German convoy was gone. No tanks, no trucks, no soldiers. Only smoke from the burning plane still curled over the road, like a ghost from the night before. He walked to the explosion site. The plane was destroyed, fuselage shattered, wings broken, bombs gone, possibly detonated fully. Metal fragments and charred wood littered the road. And tracks from tanks moving backward. He saw how they'd left deep grooves in the soil, how they'd turned, how they'd retreated. He understood. He had won. But the victory was incomplete. He hadn't destroyed the tanks. He'd only made them retreat, which meant they'd return. And then he'd be alone against 18 machines that now knew someone was in the woods who could stop them. He began gathering his things: map, compass, pistol, a little food, everything he had. He decided he must leave. Leave before they returned. Leave to find help, to report what happened, to make sure someone knew what had occurred. He walked through the forest, not toward Paris, but toward the Meuse River, where, in his mind, French forces should be. He knew if he could reach them, he could tell them about the convoy, its route, that it had retreated but wasn't gone. He walked all day, through swamps, over streams, through thickets. He didn't sleep, didn't eat. He just walked. Each step like a step to life. He felt that if he stopped, he'd lose himself. He had to prove he wasn't just a random man who got lost in the woods. He was part of something bigger.
By evening, he saw light. In the distance, on a hill, stood a small house. He approached cautiously. The door was closed. He knocked. After a minute, the door opened. A woman, about 50, with gray hair, wearing a simple scarf, looked at him with concern. "Who are you?" she asked in French. I'm a soldier," he answered, trying to speak calmly. "I'm lost. I need help." The woman silently led him inside. The house was warm. On the table, tea, bread, cheese. She didn't ask questions. She just looked at him, as if she saw something familiar in him. Fear, exhaustion, but also strength. "You look like you've walked through hell," she said when he sat down. "I almost did. I was near the tanks. I stopped them." She froze, then said, "I know what's happening. My sons serve in the army, one in infantry, the other in aviation. They haven't returned. I know war isn't a game, but you did the impossible." Jean-Pierre couldn't speak. He just stared at the floor. He didn't want to be a hero. He just wanted someone to know. The next day, the woman helped him reach the nearest village, small, but with a post office. There he wrote a short message, sending it to the French Army headquarters. The message was simple. In the Ardennes region, June 15th, around 0730 hours, a convoy of 18 tanks and over 200 soldiers was stopped. An improvised trap was used: plane explosion, sound deception, radio signal. Convoy retreated. Observation continues. Request: send reinforcements. Coordinates: 49 degrees, 45 minutes north, 5 degrees, 22 minutes east. Signed, Jean-Pierre Marté, Reconnaissance. He didn't know if it would be read. He didn't know if anyone would believe him, but he'd done all he could. 2 days later, he received a reply. The paper was official, stamped. It read, "Message received. Appreciation for actions. Reinforcements dispatched. Command recommends immediate departure from area. Your safety is not guaranteed." He smiled. It was his first recognition. He wasn't alone. But he didn't leave immediately. He stayed 2 more days, observing. He knew the Germans would return, and he wanted to be ready. And indeed, on the 5th day after the explosion, he heard the same rumble again. The tanks were coming back, but now not one convoy, two. One moving along the main road, the other taking a detour to bypass the forest. Jean-Pierre was terrified. He couldn't stop two convoys. He couldn't even imagine how. But then he remembered. He wasn't alone.
He went to the village where he'd stayed and told the woman what was happening. She said, "My son is in the resistance. He knows how to act. I can contact him." She called using an old phone that still worked. Within an hour, a young man arrived, 22 years old, in military uniform, carrying a rifle. His name was Lucien. "What happened?" he asked. "The tanks are returning. There are more. I can't stop them alone," Jean-Pierre said. Lucien listened carefully, then said, "We can do this together. We have a plan." They met in the forest. Lucien explained he had a small group of resistance fighters, 8 men total. They knew these woods like the back of their hands. They could use ambushes, booby traps, deception, and they could support Jean-Pierre. "We won't attack," Lucien said. "We'll make them make mistakes." They devised a plan. First, create false trails. They'd leave signs that a large army was moving through the woods, hundreds of soldiers, heavy equipment. They'd leave tank tracks that didn't exist, using oil stains, mud, even old tires. They'd light fires to create the illusion of a base. Second, they'd scare them. They'd use sounds, sirens, gunfire, shouts. They'd shoot into the air to create chaos. Third, they'd split the convoys. They'd find narrow spots, crossroads, bridges, gullies, and block them, preventing tanks from advancing. Jean-Pierre was excited. He hadn't expected to have a team. He hadn't expected anyone to believe in him. But he knew, without this plan, he'd already be dead. The next day, they began their operations. They burned an old warehouse in the woods, filled with wood that caught fire quickly. The flames were visible for miles. They left tank tracks, using oil, mud, and old tires to create the illusion tanks had passed. Then they started shooting, not at tanks, but into the air. They used hand grenades to create explosion sounds. They shouted, imitating commands, "Fall back, minefield, artillery." And it worked. When the first convoy reached the crossroads where the plane exploded, they saw smoke, heard gunfire, saw tracks, and stopped. The commander, via radio, requested confirmation. He didn't know if it was partisans or a real army. He ordered, "Stop and wait for reinforcements." The second convoy, moving along the detour, also encountered problems. They saw the fake tracks, heard shouts, saw fires, and decided they'd fallen into an ambush too. They stopped. Jean-Pierre and Lucien watched from a distance. They saw the Germans begin to panic. They didn't know where the enemy was. They didn't know how many there were. They didn't know it was only 8 men and 1 pilot. But to them, it was a real threat. After 3 days, the convoys began retreating. Not because they were defeated, but because uncertainty had paralyzed them. Jean-Pierre stood on a hill, watching the tanks drive away. He didn't feel joy. He felt tired, but also pride. He realized battles aren't always won with bullets. Sometimes they're won with brains. He went to the village to tell the woman it was over. She hugged him, saying, "You saved many lives. You showed that even one person can change the course of war." He didn't know if it was true, but he knew he'd done everything he could. Date, June 20th, 1940. Location, forested area near the Meuse River, France. After the German convoys retreated, Jean-Pierre didn't stay in the village. He knew the war wasn't over. He knew his actions could be used as an example, a tactical model, and he wanted his experience to help others. He traveled to the nearest French outpost, a small station on the banks of the Meuse River where reconnaissance units operated. There, he was greeted with respect. He was recognized as a hero, though he didn't feel like one. "You stopped 18 tanks," said the officer, reading his report. "Without weapons, without backup. This is almost mythical." It wasn't magic. It was logic. I used what I had: fire, sound, illusion. And I knew fear is a powerful weapon. The officer nodded, then said, "We want to use your experience. We'll form a special unit, Traps. You'll be its commander." Jean-Pierre was surprised. He didn't want to lead. He just wanted to help. But he understood. If he could teach others, he could save even more lives. That's how his new role began, as an instructor in partisan tactics. Over the next 2 weeks, he conducted several training sessions for small groups, 5 to 7 people. He taught them how to use the environment, how to create illusions, how to scare the enemy without firing a shot. He talked about explosions, sounds, radio signals, camouflage. One of his most successful demonstrations was an improvised trap set near an old bridge over a stream. They hung old tires soaked in gasoline on trees and lit them. When a tank approached, the fire blocked the road. The driver couldn't pass and retreated. It's not armor, it's psychology. If you make the enemy think there's a wall in front of them, they won't try to break through. His methods became known in the army. He was called the Master of Traps, but he didn't like the title. He wanted people to remember what mattered wasn't the name, but the result. Not everyone was happy with his success. In headquarters, voices emerged that said his methods were too risky, that he was playing with fire. Others said he was too dependent on chance. There were even attempts to remove him from duty. But Jean-Pierre didn't give up. He kept working, teaching, acting. On July 5th, he received word from Lucien. The partisans who'd worked with him earlier had encountered a new convoy, 12 tanks moving toward Sedan. They needed help. Jean-Pierre immediately set out. He arrived at night as the convoy approached the village. He met with Lucien and his team, now 12 men. They discussed the plan. "This time," he said, "we'll use sound effects on a full scale." He showed them an old generator he'd found in an abandoned house. He connected it to several speakers from an army supply depot, then loaded it with recordings, soldiers' cries, gunfire, explosions, German commands. "We'll simulate an artillery barrage," he said, "and we'll make them believe a whole division is attacking them." They placed the speakers at various points around the road. Then they burned an old church nearby. The fire was visible from afar. When the convoy approached, they activated the sounds: thunder, screams, gunfire, all played simultaneously. The Germans stopped. The commander stepped out of the tank, staring at the fire, listening to the noise. He didn't know what was happening. Then gunfire rang out from the woods, not from real weapons, from improvised cannons made from pipes and gunpowder. They fired into the air, creating the effect of real gunfire. The commander gave the order, "Retreat." The convoy began moving backwards. Within an hour, it vanished. Jean-Pierre and his team remained in the woods watching the road. They knew this wasn't a victory over the enemy. It was a victory over his confidence. He realized True strength lies in making the enemy doubt themselves.
Date: July 10th, 1940. Location: Sedan area, France. This day changed Jean-Pierre's life forever. He received a letter from the woman in the village where he'd stayed. In it, she wrote, "Jean-Pierre, I lost my son. He was in the resistance. He died trying to save one of your men. He was young, but very brave. I know you're not to blame, but I want you to know his death was not in vain. He believed in you. He said you were a true hero. I'm writing this so you never forget that every step you take matters." Jean-Pierre read the letter 3 times. He didn't cry. He just sat, looking out the window, thinking. He realized he wasn't fighting for a country. He was fighting for people, for those who lost loved ones, for those who believed in justice. From that moment, he became even more determined. He began developing new methods, not just to stop tanks, but to psychologically pressure the enemy. He studied German tactics, their command structure, how they made decisions. He understood Germans relied on order, discipline. Chaos was their worst enemy. He started using forged documents, maps, orders, radio messages, which he made himself. He left them in places where Germans would find them. He wrote in German, using old textbooks he'd found in a library. One such document was an order that read, "Attention, the enemy uses new tactics, traps, sound attacks, radio deception. All convoys must move slowly, with intervals. Any movement without permission will be punished." He left it on the side of the road where Germans often stopped. 2 days later, he heard the German commanders were demanding convoys move slower, with greater distances between tanks. This meant they'd begun fearing traps. Jean-Pierre smiled. He wasn't fighting tanks. He was fighting their minds. Date: July 25th, 1940. Location: Ardennes region, France. He received an order from higher command, returned to Paris. He was summoned to share his methods, to prepare instructions for the entire army. At first, he refused. He didn't want to leave the woods. He felt he was needed there. But then he realized if he could train thousands of soldiers, he could save far more lives than if he acted alone. He packed his things, said goodbye to Lucien and the other partisans. He headed for Paris, a city already partially occupied. Along the way, he saw destroyed homes, burned-out cars, empty streets. He felt pain, but also strength. He knew every step was a step toward victory. In Paris, he was met by officers, scientists, psychologists. They asked him to share everything, from the details of the plane explosion to creating fake radio signals. He spoke. He showed diagrams, sketches, even recorded the sounds he'd used. They were impressed, but not everyone. Some said, "This isn't real warfare. This is the art of deception." "And what is war?" Jean-Pierre asked. "It's not always battle. Sometimes it's a game of mind. If we can make the enemy make mistakes, we win." He didn't expect his words to be heard, but they were. From his experience, a special school was created, psychological operations,
where soldiers were trained to use illusions, sounds, radio deception, and forged documents. His methods became part of military doctrine. But Jean-Pierre didn't stay in Paris. He returned to the woods. He knew the war wasn't over, and he couldn't leave those still fighting.